Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. My name is Rick Kahn. I'll be talking about OT security from an endpoint perspective. I appreciate the opportunity to be with you here, and I hope this session is of use. We do have a Q&A after the fact, and my contact information will be at the end as well. So first and foremost, what would I like to try and share? I'd like to do a bit of an introduction to myself and the company that I work for. Talk a little bit about what I see as a market trend in OT security in general. And what I've seen for trends in this space in terms of trying to achieve OT security, and sometimes not always being willing to do the heavy lifting of the hard stuff. It kind of forms a basis for my premise around this argument today. And then some suggestions around what we're seeing that is working. And again, it's around the title, rapid reduction in security risk. My premise is that, if we continue to work around the periphery and not tackle it head on, we won't make any progress. Whereas if we do dig in, we can make a significant change pretty quickly. And I hope to share some of that with you today, which is where the results drive. And finally, a conclusion, hopefully leaving a few highlights with you, a few more salient points. We have about a half an hour, and hopefully I time this well enough to not go too fast. But again, there will be a Q&A after the fact. So by way of introduction, I think there's two things that I need to share. One is who I work for, which forms a lot of what we're doing and offering to clients in this space. And the second is what I actually do in my perspective. So my company, I think you've probably heard of before. We've been a participants in the Cyber Senate sessions many times before. James and his team are very good at putting on a great show and bringing good speakers, even though I made it into the lineup. He has a very interesting cross-section of subjects, so we're very happy to be here. And the reason why we think we need to be here is that we are, first and foremost, an OT solutions provider. Our founder is a systems integrator. We speak the OT language, and everything I'm going to talk about today and ever have talked about with Cyber Senate is based on our 30-year history in plants, and the security platform specifically has been around for 13 of those 30 years. So everything we're talking about is proven safe in OT environments of all sizes and shapes around the world, quite literally. We do provide software and services, both for cybersecurity, for real-time systems, historians, loop tuning, plant performance, process improvement, etc., as well as automation engineering. I myself have been working for a company like Verve or similar companies for my full 20 years in this space. So what I'm saying isn't a whole bunch of sales. This is what I call solutions. I'm the solutions lead of our solutions department. And for 20 years, I've been helping clients match where they are in the process to what tools and functions are available and what's required towards a mutually agreeable, sustainable end state. And as you see, the one thing that I really like, regardless of where I've worked, you having worked for some of the names you probably recognize, I love where I'm at now because we can be vendor neutral. We can help a client with their entire security program as opposed to just a subset of it. So why do I think there's a chance for improvement? Well, usually that means that there's something wrong with what we're doing. So let's just dig into that a little bit. Let's be honest. Perimeter security has had plenty of attention. Network segmentation, the zones and conduit Purdue model, IEC 62443, and even to a large extent some of the passive tools. But really, we've seen an uptick since people have their segments typically usually laid out. Not everybody's in that bucket yet. But many are turning to next steps. Once we have sort of a perimeter protection or zones and conduits, we then ask what's the next step. And the next two things we most often see, and I often see when people coming to ask us what we can do and how we can help them, is that they don't necessarily know their inventory and really want to understand the vulnerabilities attached with that inventory. So what do we have and how bad is it? And the result, unfortunately, I say unfortunately, but I'll clarify that, is that many have turned to passive anomaly detection. Now, don't get me wrong, passive anomaly detection is an outstanding technology. I'm quite excited by it, and I think it's an and rather than an or to what I'm presenting today. So I'm not saying to throw it out, but I am proposing that it's perhaps the wrong tool for this particular job, or the right tool, but for the wrong job. And why is it that passive anomaly detection is so appealing? Well, because it's non-invasive. You sit and you listen on a span or tap port, you listen to packets, and you at least understand monitoring. You're the canary in the coal mine, as it were. So if something goes wrong, God forbid, we'd at least know about it. And the bonus is that you get somewhat of an inventory out of it. But the reality is, when you start to dig in a little bit to the quality and the quantity of the data and what you're going to actually use it for, you find that you're a little bit exposed. And we have many clients that have got passive and are happy with it, but are really going back to the drawing board after the fact because they do need a different level of inventory. They need that endpoint data in a much more robust fashion. So again, Absolutely fantastic technology. Not saying you should scrap it. I'm saying you need to now go to the next step. And what that is driven by what is a typical day in the life in OT. This particular patch urgency decision tree, I believe I took from the IEC 62443 patching work group, which talks about what you need to know within patching. And in an OT environment, for anyone from the IT world learning today, hopefully, about what the challenges are in OT, you can't just patch. You need to have a plan B, a plan C, and a plan D, because when you get to the does it impact ICS, if the answer is yes, you need all this other information and ability to potentially provide workarounds or compensating controls outside of patching, but to be able to even understand this information, you need so much data around the asset, its context to operations, its other security indicators, its complexity, is it redundant or not, is it in a particular location belonging to a particular part of the process. All of those need to factor into the patch or no patch or compensating controls or accept the risk. And so when you realize that this level of data from multiple disciplines is what's actually required to make intelligent, informed decisions into the next steps of your security program beyond perimeter protection and now actually going to where the risk relies or resides, you'll realize that you need to go back to the inventory well once again. I couldn't find the stat in time for this presentation, but I believe it was a year or so ago. It was FireEye pointed out that 90% of OT incidents were land and expand or launched by and from OS type of assets and IT type of assets in the OT space, the same ones that have the risk, but that we can't do the same protections with. So what do we really need? When you look back at the slide I just showed you, you're probably, and this is not only what you need, but the typical journey that many people take. And I chuckle because this is where passive got us. Let's get hardware. Let's figure out what we have. But the reality is we then need to know what are the vulnerabilities that are published on that system, because it's great to know that I've got a number of these, but how many do I have? How are they configured? What is their vintage of OS? How are they? What do they have for users and software, et cetera? And so we want to know information that then includes what are the vulnerabilities. And once you know the vulnerabilities, here's all the risks that are out there. Well, what is available for a patch to fix them? And by the way, this patching pass is, the first pass is great, but every single operating entity says, great, you can tell me the patches. Can you tell me what my vendor approves or not, right? Because there's a subset here. Again, into plan B and C, there's a patch, but if it's not approved by the vendor, well, how is it configured? Can I disable the remote desktop, or can I disable the guest account or the attack vector that's being exploited by the particular risk? And if so, how many places do I do that, and how do I pull that off? Users and accounts. I've got some stats from a case study coming up that scares me, again, that you hear about data on the endpoint that doesn't come through in a passive solution, but is absolutely paramount to your ability to make informed decisions. Other security markers like anti-malware, backup, et cetera, or what zone of the network environment it is. Do we need to worry about network-based attack vectors on a dumb file server down in layer 2 of the Purdue model? But the key is OT context. I could show you 100 or 1,000 missing patches and vulnerabilities. We don't start at the top of the alphabet. We don't necessarily start at our most critical asset, but we certainly have different considerations and recommendation for a high impact asset as opposed to a low impact asset or a redundant asset. If I get a new patch, I'm probably going to test it on a redundant historian or domain controller before I do it on an engineering station, for example. So understanding all of this is a key component. And the better that you can either automate and or integrate these is important. If you don't believe me, let's look at the current job market. Now, this data is a little bit old. I think I used this last year, but it hasn't changed a whole lot. When you look at the JobSeek cybersecurity database, CyberSeek job database, you can see that at least these three categories, and partially this one in the middle, would account for primarily management tasks. And clearly, 2/3 to 3/4 are around endpoint management. So why can OT think they can get away with it and be differently? Whereas on the actual analysis and alerting sort of perimeter stuff, only 1/4 of jobs are potentially required for monitoring. The bulk of outstanding jobs and lack of people in need for improvement is in the endpoint management. Okay. Now, we've already painted that OT has a very interesting and unique approach for it. And secondly, that's very important. So how do I recommend a resolution? What is it that I'm saying you need to do different from simply perimeter monitoring? Well, to us, security is a program. It's not a project. It's not a point-in-time tool. An annual assessment is great, but it ages immediately and it's out of date within weeks, if not a month or two. And so what we 100% advocate is going directly to the endpoint. We advocate a very robust asset inventory. We advocate using an agent. Why do we want to use an agent? Well, there's already 3 or 4 or 5 agents on those HMIs and engineering stations. They're doing things like providing antivirus, whitelisting, or backup solutions. Why can't an agent also profile for me and protect that endpoint? If you recall, I'd said that we've been putting agents on OT environments for 13 years. We've never tripped a plant or voided a warranty. We've proven that you can do it. Use agentless to profile your networking gear, your embedded PLCs, relays, controllers, etc. And you build yourself a robust inventory that tells you hardware, software, and inventory. But because I'm going right to the endpoint, I can also see how they're configured. I can see what users and accounts and software, etc. are on them. And if I start to build context around it by pulling in the backup status, the antivirus status, or tribal knowledge from the operators as to asset impact, criticality, location, ownership, etc., I now am building a live and automated update that provides context. So instead of just saying I've got 10,000 risks, I can say I've got 10,000 risks, but here's the 1,000 that are high, that are critical risk. And of those 1,000, here's the 300 that are associated with high impact assets. And of those 300 that are high impact assets with a critical risk, I can further filter to those that failed their most recent backup. That half dozen or dozen systems that meet those criteria allow you to take your scarce resources and direct them directly at your highest risk, that is a failed backup on a high impact asset with a critical risk. That context is only available if you build that 360-degree view around the asset. It goes immediately back to that decision tree I showed you earlier. I need that data in a timely fashion, and it needs to update as I go for it to be of any value for me. But once I have that, I have an extremely compelling and powerful ability to pivot into any specific security function I want, which is where we get to the next part. The same advocacy for the agent means that I can also use the agent to make changes safely in an OT environment. I'll talk about how that looks with the scarce resources in a large global enterprise in a moment. But if you build this stack together, automated inventory, other security indicators, and operational context with the ability to make corrections, you can then alert on changes or deviations, and the reporting becomes a live assessment. No more do you need to pay money on an annual assessment that ages the minute you hand it over. You could have a live assessment so that as you're making progress, you see that you're improving in certain areas or on certain tasks. Or conversely, something like Bluekeep comes out, you drop it in this same database, and because you have all of the context, and you can see, for example, Bluekeep goes after a guest account remote desktop, I can see how many places have guest account enabled. I immediately have that insight that you don't have today. It's a game-changing perspective on giving you empirical data live that allows you to take that data and then pivot into what the most important action is in the right order that makes the most sense for your organization. So how does it look architecturally? The database, this is what we call our think global and act local, because we always get operational types scared when we talk about taking action on the data we're seeing in a dashboard. So what I'm showing here is you can have multiple facilities, each with their own agent and agentless data collection on the endpoints, pushing into a central database. And the central database or multiple databases can push to a single reporting instance. That reporting instance is able to give you visibility fleet-wide. So when you have a small team that sees something like Bluekeep come out, that small team can drop the Bluekeep mapping into your database and see exactly what that risk means for your organization. They can then, in a very targeted way, be able to use the agent and the architecture to start to preload the Bluekeep files on the endpoints, not necessarily install them. Or they can use the agent to change registry settings like disabling remote desktop, at least on lower level devices that don't need to have it enabled, or even disabling or renaming or deleting the guest account. The point is you can have a small central team, do compensating controls while you plan what your overall strategy is going to be to tackle your patching of a wide fleet of assets. And because these files are slowly making their way on low bandwidth or store and forward type of architecture, when the time comes for you to start running your patch testing, i.e. on that domain controller or that redundant historian I talked about earlier, you'll have all the data at your fingertips ready to go. Now, you can build your if-then and your knowledge statements up here once and share it across your whole fleet. So the other time savings, if a particular third-party vendor with an application you use, like a historian or a loop tuning process, were to say they had a security update outside of patching, you could drop that same data, single research, single analysis, drop it in the data and see where it maps to your assets in your environment. That if-then statement says, if you have this version of software, then here's your update. It shows in your dashboard. As you do the remediation, that reflects also in your dashboard as you make progress. So a couple of key components to make sure we share from it. And then I've got a slide that talks a little bit about some of the real world learnings and the benefits and the improvements that this particular organization made. So when you build an automated inventory with context into a single reporting instance, and the context includes other security investments, OT operational impact, national vulnerability database mapping, etc., or even if you subscribe to something like a threat intelligence or a passive anomaly detection list of alerts, pull those alerts in and map them back to your assets. You get live context across multiple disciplines. You can look at this from software, from users, from patching, from secure configuration. How are your firewalls configured? How would you like to be able to look in a dashboard and see just how many of your firewalls aren't following the DISA-STIG standard for secure firewalls that the DHS puts out? This near real-time view, in turn, provides you the opportunity to accurately assess your needs. I could walk into anywhere. I had a plant manager once tell me, say, you're here to do an assessment, and you're going to tell me that I don't patch my systems and I don't change any passwords. How does that help me? That's a great question. If I have a risk on an endpoint that's tied to a network-based attack vector low in the stack and the vendor doesn't approve it, am I going to do it or not? Well, that's up to you as an organization, but I can give you the data to allow you to build a threshold over which you act and below which you don't. You can't do that without multiple contexts. So this allows you to move from noise to accurate and contextual risk management. Just because the NVD says the score should be between 9.6 and 9.8 doesn't mean that 9.8 translates to your environment. And I just remind you back to the Bluekeep case study that I was talking about a moment ago. I've also presented that one in previous sessions. So if you wanted to go look back at James's archives, we talk in detail about the life before and after of trying to patch multiple assets in multiple locations when something like Bluekeep comes out. And the order of magnitude savings in terms of rapidly reducing is, I think that particular case study, the client went about without this type of architecture, 2,700 hours over 10 weeks, 6 or 8 guys at various levels of full-time. And after the fact, they did that same thing with 3 guys in 300 hours. So huge difference. I mean, the order of magnitude is insane. And again, the improvements are reflected in your dashboard as you progress. So really you're investing in a real-time monitor for your entire system for that endpoint. This is where you rapidly reduce the risk. And the other converse is true. When something comes out, a new risk, they instantly map to your fleet. So when the news hits the newswire that a new risk or a new vulnerability has been released or identified, and your CISO is going to phone you or your board's going to ask you, do we have it covered? You'll be able to look exactly at what you have or don't have and what your current status is. So let me show you what that looks like. Because it's a real-time, not real-time, I'm talking operational, we're not doing sub-second, but we have clients updating their data as frequently as every 15 minutes. So central headquarters is looking at multiple operating facilities to a central headquarters data center, and the data is never more than 15 minutes old. So the best benefit that we find you can do this with is to use this for continuous risk assessment. We put this in at a client, a global manufacturing client. You can read some of the stats there. But they had a combination of various programs and projects and leaders and initiatives and budgets and et cetera. And they had a sort of a collection of different things they were doing well or not so well. So that would call them a mid-level for maturity. They did have some segmentation. They had some antivirus and some whitelisting, et cetera. But was very patchwork in their effort and their deployment. So we brought the technology in as opposed to doing a paper-based assessment. And you immediately offset the cost of the software with some of that. The difference was we deployed the end management and automated reporting into their environment, and we pushed it to a dashboard. And then we went in with them to those dashboards. And we assessed the information that we're able to glean from that view. And we And those dashboards are still live today. So as they make changes, they improve, and as they go the wrong way, they turn more red from yellow and green. And some of the main findings, there were roughly 400 devices not patched for WannaCry, not Petya. But they also found 5 dual home machines. So despite their best interest in network segmentation at DMZ, they found 5 systems that were on different zones or segments that they shouldn't have been. And on those 5, 4 of them were running TeamViewer. So clearly there was a local effort to find ways into the environment that the typical remote desktop or the jump box wasn't working. And so they were effectively undoing a lot of their controls. They also, from a user review perspective, found 47 administrative accounts of departed employees on what were considered either medium or high impact assets. So their security process for removing users from endpoints, while paper-based and well-intentioned, wasn't making it through to the endpoints. And again, this is why I talk about the endpoint. Passive doesn't see dormant accounts. Passive doesn't see software that's not actively running. If you really want to know where your risk is, you got to go ask the source. The other thing they found was that while they had a group policy Active Directory around changing passwords every 90 days, somebody didn't design it right. They didn't set the flag that said they had to use a new password or couldn't reuse the last 3 or 5 or 6. And so the entire facility was running on 3.5-year-old passwords because they kept changing it to the same password, so nobody had to learn anything new. And they also had a large percentage of end-of-life assets. Everybody I talked to says, yeah, I'm pretty sure we got some old stuff out there, not sure how many or where or when, but that sort of life cycle visibility for planning and system health is instrumental in building successive year-over-year improvements and continuous compounding of your investment into returns. Now, the funny thing about this plant was that we did this first one, and I'm going to show you some of the specific findings they found outside of just technical controls. Evidence of things that pointed to a lack of procedure or lack of following the procedure. This is sort of another way of looking at the same results. They found that as they went through to the next sites, the first site started using this technology to correct it. So when we came back to show the board, the first site wasn't nearly as bad as the original report, but it was because they took the opportunity within this context to immediately get to work and start to remediate some of the risk. The other thing it allowed them to do, because we can do multi-site, is we compared multiple sites against each other, but also against emerging internet security security standards like this one, the CSC20. And so you could see we had a scoring which we kept from this public audience, but that the sites themselves were scored on their ability to achieve certain levels of maturity within CSC. And you can see that site 3 was by far the least secure. But nonetheless, you can see that you not only are able to measure individual endpoints, but you can measure against your other assets, you can measure against best practices, any sort of thing you want to help to decide as an organization. If we're more concerned about malware versus software or configurations, that's fine. You can pick and choose once you have the data at your fingertips. A couple other screens I wanted to share that were of interest. They found a lot of shared accounts, multiple shared logins, local admins, and dormant administrative passwords and users. This is a big deal, and things that, again, you find when you go to the endpoint. These are land and expand and exploitable components. We found that remote access, especially in the time of COVID, there was no defined standard for how users are connecting remotely, utilizing a VPN, or which devices were being used as jump boxes and how those devices were configured. And so we're able to, again, understand a lot about their information and help them to use that data to plan what their next step should be. So I've only got one more slide. It's my conclusion. I just want to hit upon a few of the highlights. So my conclusion is, first and foremost, automation is your friend. Paper-based assessments, one-time manual walkdowns for inventory, even arguably vulnerability scanning, which is periodic and under controlled circumstances in OT, they're all prone to age of data and therefore atrophy of the information. The more you can automate, the better off you'll be. You have real-time data, real-time risk, and real-time understanding of the assets. That gives you the ability to act with context, which is my second point. Context is king. You need to go beyond the MAC and IP. You need to get the source. If I'm a hall monitor at a school, I can see kids that hurry at the last minute when the bell rings. I can see you kids are early, some are tall, some are short. I don't know anything about them. I don't know about their hygiene, their diet, their exercise, their education, their age, their family life, or anything. If I'm the school counselor and I go and interview each and every one of these in person, I have access to their records, I have a completely different ability to connect with them and to manage and to help them. The other thing to remember is these environments are more dynamic than you think. My first silver bullet that I saw 15, 10, 12 years ago was when whitelisting was going to be the savior for OT, another way to put something on the endpoints and not really worry about doing the heavy lifting. But they're actually more dynamic than we think. As systems get upgraded and the risks come out and people are going to Industry 4.0 and digital transformation and cloud this, more and more stuff is being pushed into that space with less and less people to watch it. If we don't tackle it head on, we'll continue to be outgapped and outpaced by how much risk is there versus how much we understand it and how well we're reducing it. And then the ability to take actions. The other challenge I have with a number of inventory tools and even passive as an inventory is that they're great for read-only and alerting, but they're not great for correcting. I can tell you how much risk you have and where it is. If you're not ready to take action on it, we're not going to get any better. That's really the value here, is the context and the visibility, but the mechanisms to correct and to make things better. And again, the more flexible, the better. We can't always just patch. So if my agent can pull your patching, great. If you can't, but it can disable an account or uninstall a problematic piece of software, then I'm helping you with that plan B and plan C. And you're also going to be much better off if you can tie multiple tools together. Not just context of the asset, but context of what other levers you have to pull. We can't always run the patch, but maybe we can rerun a backup or deploy a whitelisting tool. So I'm almost at the end of my time. I've not seen any note from the moderator. So there's no questions, at least within this format. I'm going to wrap up and show you my contact information. If any of you are interested in learning more about this, we have been doing this for a number of years. In the last 5 years, we've significantly expanded our team and our reach. We are in multiple industry verticals all around the world, and we can scale to whatever size or shape your organization might like.